Alright, I'm testing my, running the engine again, but I was testing the oil pressure sender that I replaced here recently. I've got a different kind of setup here to my water intake, because if you remember from a while back, I talked about how I had the water hose come right from the house right into this thing, and it blew the top off of that. Actually broke that and blew it off. So now what I have is a bucket here with a hose going in it. Of course it's overflowing right now, and then that's what feeds the engine. So I'll start it up here. So I've been running the engine for several minutes, trying to get the engine temperature up some, and it looks like it's probably about as high as I can go right now. But the oil pressure, you can see it is just below 80, and I suspect, well, when I was running it before, the original gauge might have been working. But when you first start the engine when it's cold, this pegs. It looks like it's pegging, but I noticed when I revved the engine before the temp got a little higher, I can see the needle moving a little. So I don't know why this engine oil pressure is up that high. I don't know if that's normal or not. I'll have to call I'll call Marine Power and ask them. But my water, so this setup works pretty good now, and it's getting good flow. So it is gravity feeding down in there, but as I rev the engine inside the C strainer, give me a second. So inside the C strainer, you can see water is down the bottom, so this doesn't fill up. It stays down low as I rev the engine. What it'll do is suck water out of that bucket down in, just like if it was sitting in a lake. So that way I'm not applying pressure in the cooling system, which is good. Here, so I'm getting good water flow, which is what you want. Exhaust. But yeah, this oil pressure surprises me. I thought it'd be somewhere in the 40 to 60 psi range, but that looks like we're like 75 right now. So it sounds good. So it's fall time now, so I'm getting close to winterizing this engine, and so I don't know, I start getting cold. Anyway, that's pretty good. I just have sort of the engine antifreeze overflow there. Doesn't really need it, just in case something spews out of there, suck it up, and then just run the gas right out of here. And I put stable, actually, stable 360, I think is what I put in there. And so this is also getting that all running through the fuel system. I'll probably run it some more here a little bit later today to make sure that that fuel's run all through the fuel system, so I can get that stable through there. So the setup, I use my bucket. I got a 5-gallon bucket, and I bought a little valve that goes on the bottom there, and that hose is what goes into my flushing tee down there. And then what I actually bought was this little float thing that's where the hose supposed to connect, because I didn't want to, like when I turn the engine off, I didn't want to have this bucket overflowing. I have to worry about that. Well, the water flow of this little thing is not enough to keep up. So when the engine's running, it actually would suck the bucket dry. So I had to just put my hose down in there and just let it run. And then that worked fine. So anyway, so much for that idea. But so that is the setup I used, and I did have the bucket up a little high so there'd be some gravity feeding into the sea strainer, so it'd be sort of prime it, so to speak, make sure there's water in there. And then once there's water in there, so there's water all in this hose, and then once it's running, then it sucks water out of that bucket again. So like I mentioned before. Oh, and about my oil pressure gauge. So when I measure the resistance, because the oil pressure sender is basically a variable resistor, and sitting here with zero pressure, it's supposed to read about 240 ohms, and then you can see this chart here. And then it like, so it's an American one, and it's in 0 to 80 pressure gauge. So at 40 psi it should read 103 ohms, and 80 it should be 3 to 3.5. Well, I'm reading, well, what I did is I disconnected the wire. So this wire right here is actually, in effect, goes all the way to that oil pressure sender. So I disconnected this from the gauge, and I just took my ohm meter and measured it, and then I used, I just did a ground somewhere here on the engine, and when it was off, it was reading 240 ohms or slightly over that, but then when it was running, it was reading just under 50 ohms. So I mean, you can kind of see, I don't know what that would work out to be, 70 some psi, but when I connected to the gauge, it was reading 80 or a little above. So what I did is I measured from my ground on my gauge, because the ground comes, basically this harness, it comes from the engine. This is what's supposed to feed the dash. And the ground that when I measured ground from here to the ground on the engine, I was reading, should be close to 0 or some few, single digit ohms or something. And I was reading, I forget what number it was, but it wasn't near that. So I don't have a good ground. Something's weird here. So I'm gonna have to look at that a little bit more. So I don't know, I mean, because when the engine was running, as it warmed up, like I mentioned in the earlier video, I saw it around 75 psi, but I'm not sure that's actually what it was, because this basically measuring resistance. If there's a problem with the ground, it will affect this reading, I think. So, I mean, normally it would. And so if I have a ground bias, and that's. So here's the engine test sheet from before they shipped the engine to me last year, and you can see the temperature of the engine was 158 degrees, and when I was running it, I think I got it up to around 120-ish, maybe 130, somewhere in there. And you can see that at 800 RPM, I was running 60 psi. Mine was more like 75, but and then at 3,000 RPM, it was 80 psi. So, I mean, it's in the ballpark of what I was seeing. So, apparently that's correct. A higher oil pressure. All right, I thought I'd give an update. If you remember, I was talking about the oil pressure, and obviously I have my gauges disconnected here, but I was talking about how it was like 80 psi, and as the engine warmed up, it went down to about 75. I thought it was too high. Well, it turns out I talked to the engine manufacturer, and that actually is correct. Apparently, the oil pressure for these direct injection engines apparently runs higher. And I also checked the engine test sheet. Here, I'll show that in a second.